Welcome to the Heroes Keep Gaming review of Daymare 1994 Sandcastle. Daymare 94 is the prequel to 2019's Daymare 1998, a game that began its life as a fan-made remake of Resident Evil 2. And though I've been tempted to check it out over the years, I was always turned off by how recognizable the Resident Evil 2 elements were in the screenshots and trailers. With Capcom's official Resident Evil 2 remake having been released months earlier, it became an even tougher sell. I decided to give Daymare 94 a try because its trailer gave me the impression this prequel had branched off far enough from its inspiration to do something original and interesting. Having played it, maybe original isn't the best word. Its story plays out like a mashup of elements from every action game you've ever played. There are hints of Resident Evil, Dead Space, Doom, Singularity, BioShock. You get the idea. There's very little here you haven't seen done better somewhere else. But I have to admit, these are the tropes I'm a sucker for, and it does enough with these familiar sci-fi themes to weave its own compelling story. Upon entering the world of Daymare 94, the first thing that struck me was how surprisingly detailed and interesting its environmental design is. There is a genuine sense of wonder and mystery as you examine your surroundings. This, coupled with its impressive sound design, creates an effective atmosphere of suspense that compels you to approach each new room with a palpable level of caution. As you progress, these environments only become more intriguing as they continually subvert expectations. I had no idea the game takes place at the famous Groom Lake Air Force Base, also known as Area 51. I've enjoyed many games that have explored this setting, especially the PS2 original Xbox Area 51 title starring David Duchovny. I'll just say that Daymare 94 does more with the setting than you'd imagine, and it goes to some pretty cool places. When it comes to survival horror elements, Daymare 94 is not as much of a throwback as I expected. It's much closer to the Resident Evil 4 inspired third-person action games that saturated the market in the PS3, Xbox 360 era. Which is not a bad thing. I really enjoyed a lot of those games, and we don't see them as often these days. To its credit, the puzzles are well conceived. They make you think enough to be rewarding without becoming overly frustrating. The most advanced hacking puzzles do seem more difficult than they need to be, but thanks to forgiving checkpoints, you're able to attempt them until you figure out the strategy to solve them. Daymare 94 is not without merit. However, there is one major flaw that makes the game nearly unplayable: the combat. The combat is infuriating. Enemies rush you as soon as they see you, and unless you stagger them with a few headshots or a special attack, they grab you and drain your life continuously until you complete a button mashing sequence to knock them back. This means you can only take about 3 hits before it's game over. These encounters are fast and frantic, but ultimately feel cheap and unfair, to put it lightly. And it only gets worse as you encounter new enemy types. The key item you're given to make you formidable in combat is the Frost Grip. It's the cool-looking illuminated backpack that has a wrist-mounted apparatus attached to it, which shoots liquid nitrogen in a variety of forms you unlock throughout the game. Once you've located the Frost Grip, the combat begins to make sense, and the potential for something fun and unique is there. But it's overly complicated and clunky, and the enemies are way too fast for it to work as it should. So you're left repeating the same encounters several times, dying repeatedly because you aren't given sufficient time to react. On a basic level, the purpose of a video game is to present the player with a problem to overcome, or a series of problems to overcome. If the game doesn't provide the time it physically takes to react to those problems, the game is fundamentally broken. I try to avoid using extreme terms in reviews, but Daymare 1994 Sandcastle is a broken game. The combat simply does not function. The game requires the player to use a variety of techniques to eliminate every enemy, each of which take a set amount of time, but the enemies don't account for this time. For example, control is taken away from the player for the couple seconds it takes to perform an execution move on a frozen enemy. And it's possible that the second that animation ends, another enemy will instantly kill you. Every time your character is killed in the game, it feels like it's due to the inadequate combat mechanics, and when you win an encounter, it feels more like luck than skill. Load times aren't fast either. That usually doesn't bother me much, but when you're repeating a sequence dozens of times, and sometimes surviving less than 30 seconds before you have to reload it, it really compounds the problem. After the constant instant deaths, the second most frustrating moments are caused by the game failing to fully explain what it expects of the player. One example is a puzzle where you have to freeze boiling hot pipes to open a door. If you freeze them enough, they turn from glowing orange back to regular silver pipes, so you assume the job is done. But no, you have to keep freezing the pipes until they're covered in a layer of ice. This resulted in way too much time wasted because the game failed to explain how it worked. I was running between these 3 pipes for like 30 minutes. It was ridiculous. Another example of this is the red enemies. There are red enemies who are tougher than regular enemies, and while there are hints that you have to use the frost grip to defeat them, the frost grip has several different kinds of attacks, and they don't specify which is the red enemy's weakness. Again, so much time was wasted due to the game failing to explain its own rules. I fought many battles firing the frost bullet at red enemies and then shooting them thinking I'd met the requirements, only to have them regenerate indefinitely. It wasn't until I held down the frost grip attack to freeze them entirely that I found that was what the game wanted me to do all along. The last issue I have with the game is the brightness. It has the standard brightness settings, but even if you crank it up to the max, it's still extremely dark, to the point that it costs you precious seconds attempting to interpret what's on screen, no matter how much you adjust your settings. What's so odd about this is your character actually has a flashlight. When you first turn on the flashlight, it even teases you with the exact level of brightness you'd hope for, just to instantly dim to the point where you can barely see a foot in front of you. There were countless times throughout my playthrough where I found myself turning the flashlight on and off just so I could tell if it was even activated. Of course, most of the time it was. It just produces next to no light. This is so comical because in the opening cutscene of the game, your character creates a personal GPS device in 1994 by hacking into a government satellite. So she has this ability to invent technology 5 years ahead of its time, but she can't find a flashlight that illuminates her room. Next, I'll go over the technical issues I encountered during my playthrough. The most annoying bug I experienced was when my frost grip meter disappeared after a game over. The frost grip meter is the blue bar that displays how much frost grip energy you have left, essentially telling you when you have to reload using one of the limited number of frost cartridges you find. Since using frost grip abilities is necessary to survive most encounters, knowing when to reload is vital information. I was already having a difficult time with the combat, and this made it so much worse. You'd think rebooting the game or reloading a previous save would fix the issue, but I tried everything, and it wasn't until I reached the first frost grip upgrade station an hour or so later that the meter finally returned. The second worst bug I encountered was when I got stuck looking at an object. Like most survival horror games, there are objects in the environment, and you can press X to examine them and get a blurb of text to explain their significance, or often insignificance to the story. In one room, I happened to examine an object I had looked at previously. I knew I already examined it, But as I was backtracking, the prompt reappeared, so I instinctively clicked it again. There's usually no harm in that, but in this case, when I examined it the second time, the prompt to exit out of the examined screen disappeared. You'd think this wouldn't be a big deal, but I pressed every button to try to get to another menu and nothing responded. So I had to exit out of the game entirely and load the most recent save, losing a small amount of progress just because I looked at an object. The least annoying but most weird issue I experienced was when the protagonist's pupils just turned white randomly. Was not part of the story, it was just a weird glitch where her pupils just disappeared for a little while. That's a weird glitch. After finally completing the game, my playtime ended up being just under 9 hours. My death count ended up being 156 deaths. And my rank was B. A B rank.